Watchtower Bible and Tract Society publications have made a series of predictions about Christ's second coming and the advent of God's kingdom, each of which has gone unfulfilled. Almost all the predictions for 1878, 1881, 1914, 1918 and 1925 were later reinterpreted as a confirmation of the eschatological framework of the Bible student movement and Jehovah's Witnesses, with many of the predicted events viewed as having taken place invisibly. Further expectations were held for the arrival of Armageddon in 1975, but resulted in a later apology to members from the Society's leadership. English researcher George D. Chrysides has argued that although there have been some unrealized expectations, changes in Watchtower chronology are attributable more to changed chronological schemes, rather than to failed predictions. The Watchtower Society has acknowledged errors, which it said helped sift the unfaithful from its ranks, but says adherents remained confident that God's word had not failed. Background: since its formation in the 1870s, the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society has claimed that God has chosen the organization from among the churches to fill a special role in the consummation of prophetic history. Charles Taze Russell, a prolific writer and founder of the Bible student movement, viewed himself as a mouthpiece of God and later as the embodiment of the faithful and wise servant of the parable of Matthew chapter 24 verses 45 to 47. The Watchtower Society is now the legal and administrative arm of Jehovah's Witnesses. Its representatives assert that they have been given insight into the true meaning of the Bible and the unique ability to discern the signs of Christ's second coming. The group's early ideology centered on the divine plan of salvation, a biblically derived outline of humanity's history and destiny, which was believed to be open to fuller understanding in the last days. The creed incorporated Adam's fall and the entry of sin, evil and death into the world. God was believed to be permitting the world's affairs to run the ruinous course before he implemented his plan to free humanity from evil, suffering and death by means of the sacrificial death of Jesus Christ and the later establishment of God's kingdom on earth after his second coming. The kingdom would be inaugurated through two phases, one destructive, the other constructive. In the first phase, earthly institutions would be overturned in a tumultuous period known as the Battle of Armageddon. For several decades the group believed the worldwide disintegration of the social order would take the form of a bloody struggle between the wealthy and laboring classes, resulting in terror and anarchy. This would be followed by an era of grand reconstruction, in which sickness, pain and death would be removed and righteousness would triumph. Prior to the establishment of the kingdom, a chosen little flock of 144,000 anointed Christians would undergo physical transformation from physical to spiritual form to achieve immortality. Since 1925, the Society has taught that Armageddon will be a universal war waged by God, resulting in a slaughter of the unfaithful. With the doctrinal change, the focus of the movement's chiliasm changed from awaiting its collective escape from Earth to waiting for the impending destruction of the present world order in the Battle of Armageddon. To clarify its identity, the group, which came to form the Bible student movement, formulated a body of historical doctrine, including a mythical self-history, which provided a comprehensive symbolic linkage with the past, but also fortified the movement's expectations for the future. 1878, End of the Harvest. In 1876, Russell adopted the belief promulgated by some Adventist preachers that Jesus's parousia, or presence, had begun in 1874 and that the gathering of the little flock preliminary to the grand climax was already in progress, using a form of parallel dispensations that incorporated types and antitypes, historical situations that prefigured corresponding situations. Later in time, he calculated the harvest would extend only to 1878, at which time the gathered saints would be translated into spirit form. The year would also bring the beginning of the exercise of power of God's kingdom, with evidence that God's favor was returning to the Jews. The failure of Russell's prediction did not significantly alter the movement's short-term, date-focused orientation. In early 1881, Russell asserted that 1878 had, indeed, been a milestone year, marking the point at which the nominal Christian churches were cast off from God's favor. 1881, a revised end of the harvest. By 1881, Russell had found a biblical basis for extending the harvest to a new date later that year. He explained, coming to the spring of 1878, we naturally and not unreasonably expected some change of our condition, and all were more or less disappointed when nothing supernatural occurred. But our disappointment was brief, for we noticed that the Jewish church was the pattern of ours, and therefore we should not expect parallels to Pentecost or to anything which happened in the beginning of this church. Russell wrote that the light upon our pathway still shines and is more and more glorious, and that since 1878 the light had glowed stronger. The timing of the translation to heaven seemed nearer. He wrote, "We know not the day or hour, but expect it during 1881, possibly near the autumn, where the parallels show the favor to Zion complete and due to end, the door to the marriage to shut, and the high calling to be the bride of Christ to cease." The second failure in 1881 precipitated a more serious crisis in the Bible student ranks, and for several years Russell's followers waited for the belated translation to occur. Russell's chronological timetable had already identified 1914 as the ultimate end of the time of trouble, and this preserved the commitment of followers who might have been discouraged by the failed expectations for 1881. Yet many members found it inconceivable that their earthly departure might be delayed that long. Russell consoled members with the news that 1881 had still marked the time when death became a blessing, in the sense that any saint who died would henceforth be instantaneously changed into a spirit being. The revised view provided comfort for early believers who had held the view that the living faithful would never experience a physical death, and yet had seen other members in fact dying while they awaited their upward call. After 1881, physical death was defined as one of the ways in which some of the saints might undergo their translation. 1914, the end of human rulership. Russell's studies in the Scriptures series had explicitly identified October 1914 as the full end of the times of the Gentiles and consequently, the farthest limit of human rulership. It would bring the beginning of Christ's millennial reign, and all his followers expected the immediate translation of the saints to rule with the revealed Christ that year. Following the earth's tribulation and unrest, the Jews would return to God's favor, the nominal church would have fallen, the final battle between Christ and Satan would have ended, the kingdoms of the world would be overthrown, and Christ would have gathered his saints into heaven, where they would reign with him, and when the millennium would begin. The belief was unequivocal, based on his study of the Bible and the Great Pyramid, and satisfied only upon the establishment of an earthly paradise. Russell remarked that by altering the prophecy even 1 year would destroy the perfect symmetry of its biblical chronology. In the second book of his Studies in the Scriptures series, he described it as an established truth at the final end of the kingdoms of this world, and the full establishment of the kingdom of God will be accomplished at the end of AD 1914. The result, he wrote, was that all present governments will be overthrown and dissolved, along with the destruction of what God calls Babylon, and what men call Christendom. In an 1894 Watchtower, responding to readers who questioned whether, because of recent political upheavals, the world could last until 1914, he wrote, "We see no reason for changing the figures, nor could we change them if we would. They are, we believe, God's dates, not ours. But bear in mind that the end of 1914 is not the date for the beginning, but for the end of the time of the trouble." As 1914 approached, excitement mounted over the expected change of anointed Christians. Early that year, some Bible students, convinced the end of the world had arrived, began distributing the material belongings, abandoning their jobs and eagerly anticipating the future. In May 1914, 5 months from the expected end, Russell warned followers against succumbing to doubt. There is absolutely no ground for Bible students to question that the consummation of this gospel age is now even at the door, and that it will end as the Scriptures foretell in a great time of trouble such as never was since there was a nation. We see the participants in this great crisis banding themselves together. The great crisis, the great clash, that will consume the ecclesiastical heavens and the social earth, is very near. But by September, Russell was preparing Watchtower readers for the possibility that Armageddon may begin next spring. Yet it is purely speculation to attempt to say just when. Yet the evidence, he wrote, still pointed to the year just before us, particularly the early months, when again nothing took place. Predictions regressed to their earlier short-term orientation. The Watchtower wrote, "It may be that many of the Lord's people were expecting more than they should have looked for to occur with the opening of the Jewish year 1915, which began with September 21st. The human mind seems to have a natural tendency, and one with which we should have sympathy, to expect matters to culminate more rapidly, fulfillments to come more suddenly than they ever do come. Studying God's Word, we have measured the 2,520 years, the 7 symbolic times, from that year 606 BC, and have found that it reached down to October 1914, as nearly as we were able to reckon. We did not say positively that this would be the year. We merely left everyone to look at the facts of history and reckon for himself." He took that opportunity to remind readers of some cautionary pronouncements he had made several years earlier. In 1912 he had left open the possibility that, if nothing happened in October 1914, it could still happen in October 1915. He also pointed out that the period of transition could run a good many years. In a lengthy article of Constellation, Russell read that it was a testing time for Christ's disciples and that some Bible students had unreal expectations. He said it was also possible that God's kingdom on earth would be established gradually. We find that some have one idea and others another. Some think that just the next hour after midnight would see a great change everywhere, evil blotted out in 60 minutes or in 60 seconds. But would it be a reasonable expectation that the Gentile kingdoms would be snuffed out inside of an hour or inside of a day? If God had said so, it would be different. We know that God has all power to do His will everywhere. But are we in any sense of the word to expect such a sudden transition, that going to bed on the night of September 20th we would find, on the morning of September 21st, all the kingdoms of the world destroyed and the kingdom of Christ set up, the saints in glory, etc.? Such would be a lightning change. We do not think that any would have been justified in so thinking. If any had such expectation, it was unwarranted. Yet on October 2, 1914, he entered the staff dining room at the Watchtower Society headquarters and declared that the Gentile times had ended and that their kings have had their day. It signaled that God had withdrawn his benevolent disposition towards the Christian nations. The statement implied that the legitimacy of earthly governments had been downgraded in the eyes of God, which sociologist Joseph Zeigman suggested may have contributed to the subsequent adoption of bolder tactics in condemning the global political system. Russell viewed the outbreak of World War I as the beginning of Armageddon, which would soon descend into worldwide revolution, and in 1916, shortly before his death, he reaffirmed his conviction that the end was close and the harvest of saints was ongoing. Some of us were quite strongly convinced that the harvest would be ended by now, but our expectations must not be allowed to weigh anything as against the facts. We see no reason for doubting, therefore, that the times of the Gentiles ended in October 1914, and that a few more years will witness their utter collapse and the full establishment of God's kingdom in the hands of Messiah. In posthumous editions of his studies in the Scriptures, entire sections were rewritten to accommodate the failure of the anticipated events, with 1914 now identified as the beginning of the end of Gentile times. The outbreak of World War I was taken to be its confirmation. Sociologist James Beckford claimed that Russell's sometimes ingenious ex post facto rationalizations of events in 1914 contributed to the survival of the Bible student movement. Under doctrinal changes introduced by his successor, Joseph Franklin Rutherford, it was later decided that the millennium would come within the generation of those who saw the events of 1914. The years of 1799 and 1874, until then significant dates in Russell's millennial chronology, were also abandoned. Yet Chrysside said there was no clear failure of the predictions surrounding 1914. Although there was clear disappointment at the non-occurrence of certain empirically observable events, a number of the events to which Russell alludes are incapable of disconfirmation. One cannot verify the beginning of Christ's sovereign rule, the cleansing of the sanctuary, and the admission to heaven of those who have experienced the high calling. Even events like the ending of the Gentile times do not have obvious empirical indicators. 1918, the new terminus. Russell's final revision of his predictions was to identify 1918 as the new terminus. The shift was based on the reasoning that the period of the Jews' favor may have lasted until 73 CE, rather than 70 CE. For the modern-day parallel, the adjustment meant the conclusion of the 40-year harvest period was moved from 1914 to the northern spring of 1918. Rutherford claimed in 1917 that the testimony of Bible students themselves confirmed that the harvest was not over. Many have consecrated and given evidence of spirit begetting since 1914, which is the best evidence that the harvest is not yet closed. Quote, "If the new date was reliable," he wrote, "and the evidence is very conclusive that it is true, then we have only a few months in which to labor before the great night settles down when no man can work." The Finished Mystery, written soon after Russell's death by two prominent Bible students and published in 1917, made a series of bold statements about the expected demise of false Christianity. The spring of 1918, it said, would bring upon Christendom a spasm of anguish greater even than that experienced in the fall of 1914. God's day of vengeance, the book said, would break like a furious morning storm in 1918. destroying the churches wholesale and the church members by millions. At the time, there is every reason to believe the fallen angels will invade the minds of many of the nominal church people, driving them to exceedingly unwise conduct and leading to the destruction at the hands of the enraged masses, who will later be dragged to the same fate. In one short year, 1917–1918, the vast and complicated system of sectarianism reaches its zenith of power, only to be suddenly dashed into oblivion. One large part of the adherents of ecclesiasticism will die from pestilence and famine. When 1918 also passed without any sign of fulfillment, the initial reaction was that the harvest had indeed finished and that the full complement of those destined for translation to heaven had been assembled. The further delay in the arrival of the millennium was interpreted in 1919 as a sign that the loyalty and powers of endurance of the kingdom class were being tested, and that God was finding fault with some supposedly sanctified people. In a 1922 convention address, Rutherford retrospectively defined 1918 as the time when Christ entered the temple for the purpose of judgment. He later wrote that it was only after 1918, when the Lord came to the temple, that it could be understood that 1914 had also marked the time when the heavenly part of God's kingdom was established and when a new nation was born. For that time, the Bible student group was able to view itself as more than just an agency for completing the ranks of the 144,000 who would rule with Christ. With the new nation already born, members were given a clear twofold purpose: to recruit and train a great company who would be carried through Armageddon to live in the earthly kingdom, and to expose the machinations of the devil in trying to obstruct the kingdom's earthly establishment. 1925 Resurrection of the Patriarchs. With Rutherford now the movement's chief theologian, another round of prophetic revision ensued, this time focusing on 1925. In his 1920 booklet Millions Now Living Will Never Die, Rutherford wrote that he expected the ancient patriarchs and prophets, the faithful ones of old, to be resurrected to earthly life in 1925 as a prelude to a general physical resurrection of faithful followers of God destined for everlasting life on earth. He explained, "This is the golden age of which the prophets prophesied and of which the psalmists sang, and it is the privilege of the student of the divine word, today, by the eye of faith, to see that we are standing at the very portals of that blessed time. Let us look up and lift up our heads. Deliverance is at the door." Rutherford's belief that the patriarch's return would occur in 1925 was based on his calculations of the Jewish Jubilee, counting forward 3,500 years from 1575 BCE. As the year advanced, he wrote of the urgency of witnessing in the few remaining months, though he also provided a caution that not all the expected events might occur. When the prediction failed, the Watchtower Society suspended the issuing of prophecies centered on a specific date. Chrysides concluded, this expectation was too specific and empirical for the date to be adjusted as the expected event spiritualized. At a convention the following year, Rutherford admitted his error, claiming that the 1925 date was merely an expressed opinion. Yet Rutherford did not abandon the prediction. In 1929 the Watchtower Society bought a piece of land in San Diego, California, where a Spanish mansion was built and named Beth Sarum. As late as 1932 Rutherford was still delivering talks about the nearness of the kingdom. He declared that the preaching work of the witnesses was coming to a conclusion, that Armageddon was only a short time away, and that the end was much less than the length of a generation. In the late 1930s Rutherford affirmed his intention that Beth Sarum should accommodate at least some of the return returning princes, and that it should stand as a monument to the organization's firm expectation, although no new date was ever assigned to the expected event. The building was sold in 1948 and the doctrine of the return of the prophets dropped in 1950.